Good Shabbos. This week's Parsha is Parshas Emor. And at the end of Parshas Emor, we have an insight into how the Torah understands the concept of justice. A very famous passage at the end of the Parsha says the following: V'ish ki yaka kol nefesh adam mos yumos. Any man who smites another man, who kills another man, he shall surely die. Then it goes on to say, somebody who smites or kills an animal, he shall pay. And it uses the term nefesh tachas nefesh, a life for a life. And then it goes on to say even further, and anyone who puts a blemish or causes harm to his friend, as it was done to him, so it shall be done. As it was done to the victim, so shall it be done to the perpetrator of the crime. Shever tachas shever, a break for a break. Ayin tachas ayin, an eye for an eye. Shein tachas shein, a tooth for a tooth. Kashayiten mum ba'adam kenyan bo. As a person causes a wound to his friend, so too shall it be done to him. And then it says, Umake behemi yishalmen, as someone who kills an animal, he shall pay. Umake adam yumas, and whoever kills a man, he shall die. This is a passage which is very, very much discussed throughout rabbinic literature. And of course, everyone's familiar that in Judaism and in Jewish law, we do not say that if you take out an eye, that your punishment is for your own eye to be taken out. A lot of us associate that with Sharia law, and we look at that and say that's not the Jewish approach. And how could we say that? The Torah seems to say very clearly and literally an eye for an eye. So again, the rabbinic literature spends pages and pages in the Talmud explaining why this is not to be taken literally, and it only means a monetary payment in place of the eye, for example, that you might have taken out of your friend, or he might have once been your friend, probably not anymore. And the question is, why does the Torah write it in such a way? There's a very interesting passage in Maimonides which says the following. Maimonides says that although the rabbinic literature tells us that an eye for an eye does not mean to be taken literally and is actually referring to a payment, the main intention of the Torah is to be taken as is, that an eye for an eye. It doesn't mean that Maimonides actually says you should take an eye for an eye, but he's saying there's meaning in the text and in the way that the Torah describes the punishment as an eye for an eye. And this is after a long passage in Maimonides in his Guide for the Perplexed, where he talks about the whole idea of punishment being a measure for measure. In Hebrew, midah keneged midah. What you do shall be done to you. What goes around comes around, as they say. And that's exactly consistent with this whole section. And if you think about it, when you kill a person, nobody says, oh, it just means pay. Right? There's got to be some punishment. Again, in modern times in Canada and in many countries, they no longer use the death penalty, but they put someone in prison for the rest of their life, which you could even argue is the equivalent of really taking away that person's life in essence. But certainly, nobody says, oh, no problem, you killed a man, put a price on his head and pay. And actually, the Torah says in other places, there's no way you should ever have to pay kofar. You don't pay kofar, the cost of a life, in order to get away with ritzicha, with murder. And nobody would assume that. But yet, when you take someone's eye out, which is somewhat similar, we don't look at it that way. Right? Our justice system, very few justice systems say that you should actually get that kind of severe punishment. And again, the rabbis are very much against it. So what Maimonides, I think, is trying to say is that really, in essence, that should really be the punishment. What you do should really have an effect on your life in the same way that you caused it. The idea of midah keneged midah, measure for measure, is something which is not just a part of our justice, not just our justice system, or not even in our justice system in that way, but it's part of the way God created the world. It's the way God created nature. And it's very similar to the idea of you live by the sword, you die by the sword. If you're a violent person and you're constantly at someone's throat, you'll probably die a violent death. If you treat other people disrespectfully, you'll probably be treated disrespectfully. If you steal, if you're part of a sort of a conglomerate of people who are active in taking advantage of and extorting people, you'll probably end up being the victim of one of those extortions also. That's generally how the world works. And it's not so much that God actually causes this to happen. It's not so much that if you steal, God makes sure to send a thief to your house and steals your money, but rather it's how God put this idea within nature. That's the way the world works, and he created that world, that measure for measure. Now, does it always work like that? No. Is it a guarantee that murderers will get murdered, or that they'll be caught and they'll be put in prison, or that they'll even have to pay for the damages that they caused the family? No, that doesn't happen. It's not a guarantee, but it's generally, and I think the focus is on generally, the way the world works, right? Everyone understands that Saddam Hussein died by the sword because he lived by the sword. Gaddafi died by the sword, he lived by the sword. Hitler, we can go through many examples, but there are examples of people who were terrible murderers and lived a long life and died without being punished and without even being caught. So we know it's not a guarantee, but it's generally the way the world works. And therefore, Maimonides is saying the Torah is trying to tell you that you should realize that what you do has an effect on your own life. If you act in a certain way, you're disturbing the nature of the way things should go smoothly, and you're causing harm to yourself. And sometimes it happens by itself, right? If you're cheat in business, someone will cheat you. But oftentimes it's the court system, it's our human court system, which through the Torah, for example, here, which has to institute this form of punishment to make sure that message is clear. But then we have two issues. We have one issue, really. There's a contradiction between the different possibilities that could happen as a result of a crime. So, for example, let's take the eye for the eye. You could say, let's take the eye out for the eye, and therefore this man who caused this harm will be punished severely, and rightfully so. But then what happens to the victim? The victim still loses his eye. He goes through his life without his eye, and he can't make a living, for example. Especially if he lost an arm or two arms, the damages are severe. The pain, the suffering, the medical expenses, they're just going to go by the wayside, and this fellow's now there's two people without an eye. So there's no benefit. So you could say, let's have both punishments. Let him have to pay, and let him also get his eye taken out. And there's a concept of, in the Torah, and the Talmud talks about this, of double jeopardy. You can't punish someone twice for the same crime. And although that could be argued and debated, simply I think everyone understands that it makes sense. You can't punish someone two or three different ways for one crime. It's either one punishment or the other. That's somewhat logical, and it's embedded in many legal systems. And the Talmud says that that's an idea and concept which is inherent in the Torah. And I think, therefore, going back to Maimonides, what he's trying to say is, really, a human court system should try to reflect what God really wants, or what God embedded in nature, and try to show you that you have to realize that what you do is going to cause you harm. And not everyone realizes that. Even if years later they die by the sword, it might be too late. So the human court system that we establish has to try to make sure that, to educate people, first of all, the person who's the perpetrator of the crime, and also for other people in society. And that's one of the reasons why we have punishment, is for a deterrent for other people. So the fact that you punish him is a deterrent for this person he's no longer going to kill. He gets exactly what he's deserving, and other people see that message. Other people learn that lesson, that if you kill, you die, and therefore it's going to deter them from future crimes. But when it comes to an eye for an eye, the Torah had to say, and the rabbis understand it in this way, we have a problem. Which punishment is going to be? Is it going to be the deterrent factor? Is it going to be the measure for measure factor? Or are we going to say, hey, we have to compensate the victim? So in this case, they say, listen, what's more important here? the fact that this person is punished, or the fact that the victim is able to survive and live a life that he at least somewhat similar to what he had before by some kind of compensation. And we say the compensation is more important. The victim himself, if he's told, what do you choose? Do you want that person to suffer or do you want to be compensated? He would probably, in most cases, and we assume for society that that's the better rule, is that the compensation would be the more appropriate one. So therefore, the Torah gives it over in a way of saying, yes, an eye for an eye, that's really the ideal. But since we can't actually do that because we want to make sure the victim is compensated, we say it doesn't really mean it literally, but rather it means you pay the equivalent of an eye, and therefore you pay the damages. That works out for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. But when it comes to life, you could have the same argument. You could say that if I killed someone, or if somebody killed someone, that person, instead of getting the death penalty, should pay the damages, because the family now lost, for example, the breadwinner. They lost their father, their mother, their brother, their sister. Their life has changed, and they're suffering for the rest of their life, and they might be suffering economically. So you should say you should pay. And yet we don't say that here. So I think it's, again, because of the choice of, there's a few things going on. There's the deterrent value. And here, the deterrent of the death penalty is so important in society to make sure that murder is something so far into anyone's thought process that that's what we choose over compensation. Number two, the victim can no longer be compensated because he's not alive. And number three, the family who would be normally compensated would probably say, in this case, that the need for justice, and maybe even want to call it revenge, is so strong that will override their need for compensation. Not in all cases and not everybody, but generally speaking. And therefore, with the fact that the family might choose that, the victim is no longer alive, and society in general needs that deterrent for a crime so terrible. Therefore, we understand a life for a life to be taken literally. So the general concept flows constantly. Really, the idea of justice is measure for measure. But what we really want to do is make sure that we also are kind to the victims, and therefore we pay them and make sure they're paid under these circumstances. That's the general flow of this portion, and what it's trying to say, I believe, according to Maimonides. And hopefully that makes us think ourselves about what we want in society. When people commit crimes and even murder, we have to ask ourselves, what is the purpose of the punishment? Is the purpose deterrence? Is the purpose to make sure they're paid? Are we doing God's justice? Is that our job? Or is the human court system not to do God's justice, but to make sure society survives and thrives? And therefore, there's always a balance between all of these different elements. And the Torah and the Talmud, understanding it, and the way Maimonides understands it, comes to this determination under these circumstances. Right? In modern times, we also say that a lot of people say, if you want society not to be murderous, then you shouldn't murder. You shouldn't take the life of even a murderer, and that seems to be the dominant way of thinking in many Western countries. Just as an example, in Israel, of course. In Israel, they don't have the death penalty, but they made the exception for Adolf Eichmann because his crimes were so terrible. In other words, that's what they're balancing. They're balancing that need. They don't want to create a society that takes the life or that allows someone to be taken life, even that of a terrorist or a murderer. On the other hand, there's a certain point where the deterrence and the message for society is so important that overrides. So hopefully that's food for thought, and we could always learn from those laws in the Torah and understand that these laws are not just laws that are prescriptions that we just listen to and that's the way it is, but rather try to understand the depth of understanding beneath these laws, that which is really the motivating factor behind these laws, and that would be relevant to our own society and to how we set up our own justice system and how we even involve ourselves with our neighbors, our friends, our family. Was what are we trying to gain when we try to make sure that somebody is quote unquote punished for their crime? Good Shabbos.